Judge Richard Harrison sat in his familiar leather chair, adjusting his black robe as he prepared for another long day at Atlanta Municipal Court. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. At 52 years old, with graying temples and stern blue eyes, he had become a fixture of the courtroom. He had earned a reputation for being strict but fair, at least that was what he told himself. After serving on the municipal court for 3 years, he had grown accustomed to the routine of traffic violations and minor offenses. The predictable rhythm of the court, cases filed, decisions made, fines imposed, was something he could almost do in his sleep. The clock on the courthouse wall showed 9:45 a.m. when case number 2374 was called. Harrison glanced up briefly as the courtroom door opened and a woman stepped in, but he immediately returned to his papers. Dr. Michelle Carter, however, stood out even in the small, half-empty courtroom. Her posture was straight and confident, yet there was an urgency about her that Harrison didn't fail to notice. She wore a crisp white blouse under a navy blazer, her hospital ID badge clipped to her pocket, a detail the judge didn't pick up on right away. He was too busy flipping through the stack of papers in front of him to register the significance of the badge. Case number 2374, speeding violation on Peachtree Street, the court clerk's voice echoed in the quiet room. Harrison's gaze remained fixed on his papers as the clerk continued. Dr. Michelle Carter is present to answer the charge. Harrison barely looked up as the woman approached the bench, her steps measured and purposeful. He glanced at the ticket, which indicated a speeding violation, 47 miles per hour in a 35 miles per hour zone. The offense had occurred at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night. A simple case, he thought, his mind already shifting toward the next one. He glanced at the woman's face for only a moment before addressing her. "Miss Carter," he began, deliberately omitting her professional title. "How do you plead to the charge of exceeding the speed limit?" Michelle stood tall, her voice clear and unwavering as she responded. "Your Honor, I would like to explain the circumstances. I was responding to an emergency call from the hospital. I'm a cardiac surgeon." Judge Harrison's eyebrows furrowed, but he interrupted before she could continue. His tone carried a hint of impatience. "A simple guilty or not guilty will suffice, Miss Carter. We have a full docket today." The young police officer who had issued the ticket shifted uncomfortably behind Michelle. He remembered the night vividly, the night Dr. Carter had shown him her hospital ID and explained the critical patient she was rushing to help. Despite the explanation, he had still followed protocol and issued the ticket, noting the mitigating circumstances in his report. He hadn't expected the ticket to become an issue, but now it was clear the situation was becoming more complicated than he had imagined. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Michelle replied firmly, maintaining her composure. "And I would appreciate being addressed as Dr. Carter. I have documentation from Grady Memorial Hospital confirming the emergency call, as well as the details of the patient I was responding to." But Harrison was already cutting her off. His voice, though firm, betrayed no real interest. "This court is not interested in excuses, Dr. Carter. The speed limit exists for everyone's safety, regardless of your occupation." He paused and glanced at the papers in front of him. "The fact is, you were observed traveling at 47 miles per hour in a clearly marked 35 miles per hour zone." A few people in the courtroom exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the judge's tone seemed off, sharper, more dismissive than usual. It felt like more than just a simple traffic violation. But Harrison didn't notice. His focus remained fixed on the facts as he saw them. Michelle reached into her briefcase, pulling out several documents. "Your Honor, if you would just review the emergency room records and the letter from the Chief of Surgery, it may provide some context for—" "That won't be necessary," Harrison interrupted again, his voice cold and final. "This is a straightforward case. The officer's radar gun reading is clear evidence of the violation." The police officer, Officer Brooks, stepped forward tentatively. "Your Honor, if I may." "That won't be necessary, Officer Brooks," Harrison said firmly, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. He shuffled some papers on his desk, unwilling to meet Michelle's steady gaze. "Given the speed recorded and your apparent lack of remorse, Dr. Carter, I am imposing the maximum fine of $250, plus court costs." A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. The imposition of the maximum fine was rare for first-time speeding violations, especially when there were extenuating circumstances. Michelle stood motionless for a moment, her expression carefully controlled. She was no stranger to dismissals and assumptions, having faced both in her career for years. After 15 years as a doctor, she had developed a thick skin. But something about this case, this particular incident, felt different. There was a weight to it that she couldn't ignore. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the sting of the decision. "I'll make sure the hospital's legal department receives a copy of today's proceedings." As she turned to leave, Harrison was already calling the next case, his mind already moving on. He had dismissed Dr. Carter from his thoughts entirely, not noticing how Officer Brooks shook his head slightly or how the court clerk frowned at her papers. Several observers in the gallery whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. What Harrison didn't know, however, was that in exactly 2 weeks he would find himself sitting in a very different room, attending a meeting that would shed new light on his actions. The repercussions of his judgment today would soon become startlingly clear. 2 weeks after the courtroom incident, Judge Harrison walked through the gleaming glass doors of Grady Memorial Hospital. The morning was bright, and his leather briefcase swung confidently at his side. As a member of the hospital's legal advisory board, he attended these monthly meetings regularly. Today was special, however. The board was announcing the new chief of cardiology, and Harrison had been invited to participate in the proceedings. He passed through the lobby and made his way to the elevator, which carried him up to the 10th floor, where the hospital's administrative offices were located. As he stepped off the elevator, he nodded to familiar faces. He was well known among the board members, many of whom had worked with him in his capacity as a judge. The atmosphere was buzzing with excitement. People were chatting in small groups, exchanging pleasantries and discussing the announcement ahead. "Richard, good to see you," Dr. James Wilson, the hospital's CEO, called out from across the room. Wilson's eyes twinkled with a secret satisfaction, as if he were in on something important. "We've got quite an announcement today." "Quite an announcement indeed." Harrison smiled, giving a polite nod, and made his way to his usual seat near the head of the long mahogany table. He opened his leather portfolio, arranging his pen just so, and settled in for what he expected to be another routine meeting. The sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting light over the conference room, which offered a spectacular view of downtown Atlanta. Harrison felt a sense of satisfaction. This was a world he understood. At exactly 9 a.m., the meeting began. Dr. Wilson took the floor and began to speak, but Harrison's attention drifted momentarily. He couldn't shake the memory of Dr. Carter's composed demeanor in his courtroom. The image of her standing there, her dignity intact, despite his dismissive treatment, lingered in his mind. But it was a fleeting thought, easily pushed aside as the meeting continued. Harrison had no idea how much his world would shift in the next few minutes. Dr. Wilson went on to introduce the new chief of cardiology. When the door opened, Michelle Carter walked in. Harrison froze. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. This was the same woman he had dismissed in court just 2 weeks earlier. As she stepped forward to greet the board members, her gaze met his for the briefest of moments. Harrison could only stare, his mind racing, the weight of his past actions now crashing down on him. What had he done? Dr. James Wilson stood at the front of the conference room, adjusting his tie as he prepared to address the board. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a golden glow on the room. The air was filled with quiet anticipation. The legal advisory board had gathered for their monthly meeting, but today's agenda was different. Today there was an announcement to be made. A new chief of cardiology would be appointed at Grady Memorial Hospital, and everyone in the room was eager to hear who it would be. Wilson cleared his throat and began, "Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we've been conducting a nationwide search for our new chief of cardiology. It was no small task, but we found an exceptional candidate. This individual has an impressive track record, a background that speaks for itself. She's a graduate of Harvard Medical School, completed her residency at Johns Hopkins, and has pioneered groundbreaking research in minimally invasive cardiac procedures. She has a remarkable 98% success rate in emergency surgeries." Harrison, seated near the head of the table, nodded approvingly. The credentials sounded excellent, highly impressive even. He had seen the list of candidates, and though he had no direct involvement in the selection process, he couldn't help but feel that the hospital had made a sound choice. He leaned forward slightly, eager to hear more about this new leader in cardiology. Dr. Wilson continued, his voice warm with enthusiasm. "Moreover, this individual has been with Grady Memorial for the past 8 years, building our cardiac unit into one of the finest in the Southeast. She's well known within the medical community, not just for her skills as a surgeon but also for her leadership abilities and her unwavering dedication to her patients. It is with great pride and excitement that I ask you to join me in welcoming our new chief of cardiology, Dr. Michelle Carter. The door to the conference room opened and Harrison's world tilted sideways. Walking into the room was the same woman he had found just 2 weeks earlier in his courtroom, the one whose explanation he had dismissed, whose title he had ignored, and whose professional dignity he had carelessly disregarded. Dr. Michelle Carter. She strode confidently to the front of the room, her white coat pristine, her hospital ID badge now accompanied by another one marking her newly elevated position. As she walked, Harrison felt the blood drain from his face. His mind raced and his pen slipped from his fingers, rolling off the edge of the table. He stared at her in disbelief, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. This was the same woman he had treated with such indifference, and now she was here, at the center of the very hospital he had been a part of, poised to lead one of the most important departments. Michelle reached the front of the room where Dr. Wilson stood waiting. She offered a brief, polite smile, then turned to face the board members. Her voice was calm, steady, and filled with the confidence that came from years of experience. "Thank you, Dr. Wilson," she said, her tone formal but warm. "I'm honored to accept this position and am excited about the future of our cardiology department. Together, we will continue to provide world-class care to our patients and expand the services we offer to meet the growing needs of our community." As she outlined her vision for the department, Harrison remained frozen in his chair. Memories from the courtroom played through his mind like a film on a loop. He recalled how he had repeatedly called her Ms. Carter, how he had dismissed her explanation about the emergency she was responding to, and how he had imposed the maximum fine without even glancing at the documentation she had offered. He had been so quick to make a decision, so eager to get the case over with, that he had failed to see the full picture. The other board members were nodding enthusiastically as Michelle spoke. Harrison noticed how they addressed her with respect, how they leaned forward to catch her words, how they treated her as the accomplished professional she clearly was. It was a stark contrast to the way he had treated her in court. Michelle's eyes swept across the room and then, as if by design, they landed on him. "I look forward to working closely with all board members, including our legal advisory team, to ensure we're providing the best possible care while maintaining proper protocols," she said. Her gaze held his for a moment, her expression as calm and composed as ever. There was no anger, no hint of recognition or resentment, just professionalism. Harrison felt the weight of her gaze like a physical blow. He managed a weak nod, but it felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. His collar suddenly felt too tight, his breath shallow. He had thought he had been in control of the situation when he imposed that fine, but now he realized how wrong he had been, how unfairly he had treated this woman. The meeting continued, but Harrison was barely present. His mind was reeling as he watched the other board members congratulate Dr. Carter, shaking her hand, offering warm wishes and discussing plans for the future. Dr. Wilson approached him with a smile, his expression friendly, unaware of the storm brewing in Harrison's mind. "Richard," Dr. Wilson said, "I hope you'll work closely with Dr. Carter on the new emergency response protocols we discussed last month. Your legal expertise combined with her medical knowledge will make quite a team." Harrison nodded numbly, still processing what had just happened. As he watched Dr. Carter collect her papers and prepare to leave the meeting, he realized with growing dread that this was just the beginning. They would be working together closely, possibly for years to come. He had thought the worst was over, that the fine had been a simple matter of routine. But now, it seemed like the universe had a way of turning the tables when you least expected it. The morning sun still streamed through the windows, but now the room felt much warmer than before. The weight of the moment settled over Harrison like a heavy cloak. As the meeting drew to a close, he lingered in his seat, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted. He wasn't just a judge anymore, he was part of a much larger system now, one in which his actions had real consequences. 3 days later, Harrison found himself in a new office at Grady Memorial Hospital, reviewing legal documents with unfocused eyes. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence, a constant reminder of time passing. He had been asked to join the hospital's legal team, and though he was a judge by profession, he knew his role here would be different. He was now part of the very system he had once seen from the outside, part of the team that worked alongside the medical professionals to ensure that protocols were followed and patients received the best care possible. But his mind wasn't on the legal paperwork. Instead, it was on the meeting from 3 days ago, the meeting where Michelle Carter had walked in, confident and poised, a far cry from the woman he had so carelessly dismissed in court. A knock at the door startled him, pulling him from his thoughts. Dr. Carter entered, carrying a thick folder and a laptop. She was dressed in her crisp white coat, her expression neutral, but there was an air of professionalism about her that made Harrison feel small in comparison. "Good morning, Judge Harrison," she said, emphasizing his title just slightly. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." Harrison gestured to the chair across from his desk, trying to maintain his usual composure. "Yes, Dr. Carter, please have a seat." She sat down and placed her folder on the desk before speaking again. "Before we discuss hospital policies, I think we should address what happened in your courtroom," she said calmly, her voice steady but firm. Harrison shifted in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment. "Dr. Carter, about that day?" he began, but his voice faltered. He wasn't sure what to say. How could he apologize for what he had done? How could he explain the cold indifference that had led him to dismiss her so quickly? She interrupted him gently, opening her laptop and turning the screen toward him. "Let me show you something first," she said. The video on the screen was crystal clear. A dashboard camera from a police vehicle, timestamped at 11:30 p.m. on the night of the speeding violation. In the video, Dr. Carter's car passed by at a steady, measured pace. The radar gun reading flashed 37 miles per hour. Harrison's mouth went dry. He had seen the ticket. It said 47 miles per hour, but the ticket says 47 miles per hour, he murmured. Dr. Carter nodded. "Yes," she said. "Officer Brooks made a typo on the ticket. He realized his mistake later that evening and tried to inform you in court, but you wouldn't let him speak." She pulled more papers from her folder and placed them on the desk in front of him. "Here's his signed statement confirming the error, along with the hospital emergency logs showing that I was responding to a critical cardiac case that night." The silence in the room grew heavy as Harrison absorbed the evidence before him. His face grew warm with shame as he realized the depth of his mistake. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice soft with remorse, I didn't realize." She cut him off, her voice still professional but with an edge of steel. "Judge Harrison," she said, her tone unwavering, "I've been a cardiac surgeon for 15 years. I've saved hundreds of lives. That night, I was rushing to save another, a 58-year-old father of 3 who was having a massive heart attack. I made it in time. Barely. He's alive today because I didn't waste time arguing over a ticket." She laid out more documents: her Harvard diploma, her Johns Hopkins residency certificates, awards for medical excellence, and letters of recommendation from some of the country's top surgeons. "These were all in my briefcase that day in court," she said, her voice calm but filled with an undeniable strength. Harrison sat in stunned silence, realizing the full weight of his actions. His mistake wasn't just a small oversight, it had almost cost a life. And now he would have to live with that knowledge. Harrison sat quietly, his heart heavy with regret, as Dr. Michelle Carter's words lingered in the room. She had laid bare the painful truth that had been hovering at the edges of his awareness but that he had not fully acknowledged until now. "I tried to show you, to explain my situation," she continued, her voice steady but firm, "but you wouldn't even look at my evidence. You wouldn't even use my correct title." The simple power of her statement struck Harrison with the force of a physical blow. He had assumed that his actions were justified, that his role as a judge entitled him to dismiss her without a second thought. Yet now, as she spoke calmly, articulating her hurt, he felt the weight of his prejudice settle on him like a crushing weight, revealing itself not through dramatic acts of discrimination, but through the small, subtle dismissals, the refusal to listen, and the assumptions he had made without even realizing it. He had been so quick to make decisions, so eager to maintain control in his courtroom, that he had failed to see the humanity in front of him. He had overlooked Dr. Carter not because of her qualifications or lack thereof but because of his own blind spots, his own ingrained biases. She wasn't just Ms. Carter or a doctor in his eyes, she was a woman who he had dismissed too easily, whose credentials and voice he had ignored in favor of what was familiar and comfortable to him. And now he was confronted with the aftermath of his actions. Dr. Carter's gaze held his for a moment, and then she leaned forward slightly, her posture showing the slightest hint of the passion that Harrison had come to recognize was at the core of her being. "The thing is, Judge Harrison," she continued, her voice now laced with a quiet intensity, "this isn't about the fine. It's about something much bigger. In that courtroom you saw what you expected to see. Not who was actually standing before you." Her words rang true, echoing in Harrison's mind. He had allowed his biases to shape his actions, and in doing so he had failed to truly see Dr. Carter, not just as a doctor, not just as a woman, but as a person with her own story, her own struggles, her own history. And in that failure he had wounded her, both professionally and personally. The enormity of his actions crashed over him once more, and he found himself reaching for the truth she was offering. Harrison glanced down at the dashboard camera footage again, the grainy video playing out the same sequence of events, the time-stamped reading showing the correct speed at which Dr. Carter had been driving. He saw the logs from the emergency room and the patient's medical records, documents that had been right in front of him on that day in court, but ones he had failed to consider fully. And then, finally, he looked at Dr. Carter's impressive credentials, the very same ones he had dismissed with such ease, assuming that they didn't matter in the face of his own rigid assumptions. His hands trembled as the weight of his actions settled heavily on his conscience. "I was wrong," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Completely wrong. Not just about the ticket. About how I treated you. I'm deeply sorry, Dr. Carter." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before slowly nodding. The tension in the room was palpable, but there was no hint of animosity in her gaze. She seemed to understand something that Harrison was only beginning to comprehend. An apology was important, but it was not enough to undo the damage that had been done. What was needed now was something far more substantial, something that would require a different kind of commitment. "I appreciate that, Judge Harrison," Dr. Carter replied, her voice calm but firm. "But more than your apology, I need your partnership." She paused for a moment as if weighing her next words carefully. "We have important work to do here at Grady Memorial, and we need to do it together." There was a shift in the room, a subtle but unmistakable change in the dynamic between them. For the first time since their meeting began, Harrison understood what was truly being asked of him. This wasn't just about making amends for his earlier mistakes. It was about moving forward, working side by side to accomplish something that mattered, something that would have real, lasting effects on people's lives. Taking a deep breath, Dr. Carter pulled out another folder, this time a thick stack of documents that she placed on the table between them. "Now, shall we discuss those emergency cardiac care protocols?" she asked, the question lingering in the air. Harrison straightened in his chair, a new sense of resolve settling within him. "Yes, please," he said, his voice firmer now, a far cry from the uncertainty he had felt moments ago. "And Dr. Carter," he added, his words sincere, "thank you for showing me this. For making me see." He paused, letting the gravity of the moment settle. "Sometimes," he continued, his voice quiet, "the hardest things to see are right in front of us." Dr. Carter gave him a small, acknowledging smile and then opened the folder. As they began to discuss the protocols, their earlier tension seemed to evaporate. What had once been a strained relationship, fraught with misunderstanding and assumptions, was slowly being replaced by a new dynamic. They both brought something valuable to the table. Harrison's legal expertise, which could help navigate the labyrinth of regulations and paperwork, and Dr. Carter's deep medical knowledge and first-hand experience, which gave her a unique perspective on the urgency of the issue. Together, they formed a team that could tackle the complex challenge they faced. As the hours passed, they worked side by side, drafting plans and discussing strategies. Their differences, once so stark, now seemed to complement each other. The work they were doing was no longer just a matter of legalities and medical protocols, it was a shared mission, a mission to make a real difference in the lives of the people who depended on them. Harrison could feel something inside him begin to shift, as if the foundations of the assumptions he had built over the years were slowly cracking and giving way to a new understanding. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon when they finally began to wrap up for the day. Papers were scattered across the table, empty coffee cups piled in one corner, and the room was filled with the quiet hum of accomplishment. Harrison gathered his papers ready to leave, but before he could stand he turned to Dr. Carter and said quietly, "I'm glad you didn't give up after that day in court. The hospital, these communities, they need your vision." Dr. Carter looked up from her laptop, her brow furrowing slightly in surprise. She had expected a more typical end to the meeting, perhaps a brief exchange of pleasantries before they both went their separate ways. But Harrison's words caught her off guard. "They need both of us, Judge Harrison," she replied, her voice steady and assured. "Sometimes the hardest barriers to break down are the ones we don't even realize exist, especially when they're within ourselves." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. For the first time, Harrison understood that their work together wasn't just about the policies they were creating or the protocols they were refining. It was about breaking down barriers between them, barriers within themselves, and the larger societal barriers that prevented people from receiving the care they needed. As they prepared to leave the conference room, the city skyline outside Harrison's window looked unchanged, its familiar outline stretching into the distance. Yet, for Harrison, something had shifted in the way he viewed it. The city, his work, and his relationship with Dr. Carter, everything seemed different now. 1 month into their working relationship, Judge Harrison and Dr. Carter found themselves again locked in a heated discussion in the conference room. This time the issue at hand was more urgent than ever. Papers were spread across the large table, and empty coffee cups testified to the length of their meeting. Dr. Carter, we can't simply open a new cardiac care center in South Atlanta without considering the legal implications, Harrison said, his hand running through his graying hair. The paperwork alone could take months. Dr. Carter stood by the window, her eyes scanning a map she had pinned to the wall. Judge Harrison, look at these statistics, she said, her voice full of determination. People in South Atlanta are waiting an average of 45 minutes for emergency cardiac care. That's 30 minutes longer than patients in the northern suburbs. Every minute counts when someone is having a heart attack. The weight of the issue hit Harrison hard, and he knew they were at an impasse. Yet, as they debated the logistics, something was changing inside him. He was no longer just focused on the rules and regulations. He was beginning to see the true human cost of bureaucracy, the lives lost while red tape held up progress. I understand the urgency, Harrison said, picking up another report, but rushing into this could create more problems. We need proper permits, zoning approvals. Dr. Carter interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. While we wait for permits, people are dying. Just last week, we lost Mr. Jenkins because the ambulance couldn't get him to a cardiac center in time. He left behind 3 children. Harrison paused, his thoughts slowing as he absorbed the weight of her words. She wasn't just a doctor, she was someone who had seen the real-world consequences of inaction. This wasn't just about regulations, it was about people's lives. Dr. Carter pulled out a patient file and placed it on the table, her hands trembling slightly, betraying the depth of her feelings. Harrison looked at her, the difference between this moment and their first meeting so clear in his mind. She had come a long way from the woman he had dismissed in his courtroom. Now she was standing in front of him, fighting not just for her patients but for a vision that transcended bureaucracy. Look, she said, spreading out photographs of a proposed building on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. There's an old medical building there. It's already zoned for medical use. With some renovations we could have a center up and running in a fraction of the time it would take to go through all the red tape. Harrison was surprised. You've already scouted locations? I've done more than that, she replied, pulling out preliminary building inspections, cost estimates, and even rough floor plans. I've been visiting these communities, talking to families, understanding their needs. This isn't just about providing medical care. It's about showing these communities that their lives matter. Harrison picked up the building inspection report and read through it carefully. He could feel something changing in him as he worked alongside Dr. Carter. He wasn't just thinking about regulations anymore. He was beginning to see the human side of this work, the lives that could be saved by cutting through the bureaucratic delays. We could fast-track the permits, he said slowly. And if I call in some favors at the zoning office, we might get the approvals we need faster. He turned to face her, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. But we'd still need the board's approval for the budget? Dr. Carter's face brightened. I've already prepared a cost analysis showing how the center could save money in the long run. Fewer ambulance diversions, better outcomes, reduced liability. Harrison smiled, a small but genuine expression of admiration. You really have thought of everything? Dr. Carter didn't smile back, but her expression softened. I had to. Too many people are counting on this, even if they don't know it yet. They spent the next few hours working side by side, combining their knowledge and skills. As they did, their earlier tension seemed to fade, replaced by a shared understanding. Harrison's legal expertise helped streamline Dr. Carter's proposals, while her medical knowledge illuminated the urgency of their work. By the time the evening came, they had the beginnings of a workable plan. Before he left, Harrison turned to Dr. Carter and said quietly, I'm glad you didn't give up after that day in court. The hospital, these communities, they need your vision. Dr. Carter looked up from her laptop, surprised by his candor. They need both of us, Judge Harrison. Sometimes, the hardest barriers to break down are the ones we can't even see. Harrison nodded, the weight of Dr. Carter's words sinking deeper into his consciousness. As he walked to his car that evening, he realized that this challenging partnership had already taught him more than just the intricacies of hospital administration. It had opened his eyes to a broader, more profound lesson about the world, and about himself. His perspective was shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated, and it was all thanks to Dr. Carter's unwavering dedication to her patients, and to her ability to rise above the prejudice that surrounded her every day. The following Tuesday evening was rainy and cold, the kind of night when the hospital seemed to pulse with urgency. The emergency room's double doors swung open with a loud thud, and paramedics rushed in, wheeling in a stretcher while shouting vital signs as they moved. Harrison, who had been in the hospital for a late meeting, glanced up just as they pushed the stretcher into the ER. On it lay Senator William Brooks, one of Georgia's most powerful politicians. His face was gray, contorted in pain, and his eyes were half-lidded. The paramedics worked in synchronized chaos. Cardiac arrest. Began 10 minutes ago, a paramedic called out, moving quickly alongside the stretcher. Patient is 65, history of heart disease. Dr. Michelle Carter had just finished another surgery when her pager went off. Without hesitation, she ran to the emergency room, still wearing her surgical cap. Judge Harrison, who had been near the ER entrance, watched as Dr. Carter immediately took charge of the situation. There was no time to waste. "Get me an ECG stat," Dr. Carter commanded, her voice cutting through the frantic pace of the emergency room. "Start him on." She was interrupted by a well-dressed man pushing forward through the crowd. "I'm Gregory Brooks, the senator's son," he said, his voice demanding. "We demand Dr. Richardson. He's our family doctor." Without missing a beat, Dr. Carter continued checking the senator's vital signs, her hands steady as she worked. "Dr. Richardson is at home, 30 minutes away," she said coolly, not looking up. "Your father doesn't have 30 minutes. I'm the chief of cardiology. I'm his best chance right now." Gregory Brooks stepped closer, his voice sharp with resistance. "No offense, but we've been trusting Dr. Richardson for 20 years. He's the one who knows our family's medical history." Harrison watched Dr. Carter's face remain professional despite the prejudice hanging in the air. The words of the senator's son, dismissive and entitled, cut through the room, but Dr. Carter didn't flinch. She was focused entirely on the senator's condition. The monitors beeped urgently, flashing dangerous heart rhythms, but Gregory Brooks continued to argue. "Sir," Dr. Carter said firmly, her voice calm but insistent, "your father is having a massive heart attack. Every minute we wait reduces his chances of survival. I've performed this procedure hundreds of times. I'm his best chance." The senator's wife clutched her son's arm tightly. "Gregory, maybe we should let her?" "No." Gregory snapped, his eyes narrowing as he turned to his mother. "How did she even become chief of cardiology?" His words were dripping with disdain. Judge Harrison, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward, his voice firm and decisive. "Dr. Carter is the finest cardiac surgeon in this hospital. I've seen her credentials, her success rates, and her dedication firsthand. Every second you waste questioning her qualifications is putting your father's life at risk." The urgency in Harrison's voice was enough to break through the family's resistance, but the moment was shattered when the monitors suddenly screamed, indicating that the senator's heart rhythm had become critical. Dr. Carter didn't hesitate. She snapped into action, pushing past the family's objections with the precision and confidence of a seasoned professional. "He's crashing," she shouted, moving with speed and purpose. "Get a crash cart. Now." Harrison stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Judge Harrison," he said, his words carrying authority. "Please escort the family to the waiting area. This is now an emergency situation." Reluctantly, Gregory and his mother were guided out of the room, still protesting, but Harrison's firm demeanor left them little room to argue. As they moved into the waiting area, they could only watch through the glass windows, helpless as Dr. Carter worked tirelessly to save the senator's life. Inside the ER, Dr. Carter was moving like a woman possessed, her movements quick, precise, and sure. She barked orders, her focus unshakable. The defibrillator charged, and the senator's body jerked violently as the electrical shock coursed through him. Long, agonizing seconds passed, and for a moment, it seemed like all hope was lost. But then a steady rhythm returned to the monitor. "We have rhythm," Dr. Carter announced, her voice firm with relief. "Get in or prepped. He needs emergency bypass surgery." Harrison, who had stayed close by, felt a sense of awe and admiration for the woman who had just saved a man's life. 4 hours later, as the surgery ended, Dr. Carter emerged from the operating room, exhausted but triumphant. The senator's family stood up, their earlier hostility now replaced by a stunned, almost sheepish gratitude. The surgery was successful, Dr. Carter reported in her usual professional tone. "We placed 3 bypasses. Your father is stable and should make a full recovery." Gregory Brooks stood awkwardly, his previous arrogance now deflated. "Dr. Carter, we thank you," he stammered, his voice lacking the earlier bite. Dr. Carter nodded in acknowledgement and turned to leave, but as she walked toward the exit, Harrison fell in step beside her. "That was incredible," he said quietly. "How do you handle it?" The prejudice, the doubt, the constant need to prove yourself? Dr. Carter stopped walking, her exhaustion momentarily visible in the way she sagged slightly, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the night's events caught up with her. But she didn't let it show for long. Her voice was steady, her answer simple. I handle it because I have to, she said. Because every time someone like Senator Brooks survives, it's not just a life saved. It's a mind changed. Maybe next time, his family will see a black doctor and remember tonight. Harrison stood in stunned silence for a moment, reflecting on her words. He thought about how much he had changed since that day in his courtroom, about how Dr. Carter had forced him to confront his own biases, often without even realizing it. You changed my mind, Harrison admitted quietly. I didn't even realize how biased I was until you forced me to see it. A small, knowing smile touched Dr. Carter's lips. The hardest prejudices to fight are the ones people don't even know they have. But tonight we didn't just save a senator. We saved a father. A husband. That's what matters. As they walked toward the hospital cafeteria for a much-needed coffee, Harrison couldn't help but marvel at how much he had learned from Dr. Carter in the few months they had worked together. He had spent years in a courtroom, immersed in the rigid rules of law, but it was here in the hospital that he was learning the true meaning of justice. Sometimes the most powerful lessons didn't come from law books or rulings from the bench. They came from witnessing someone rise above prejudice, above hate, to simply do what was right. The following week, Harrison found himself sitting at the back of a crowded conference room at Grady Memorial Hospital. Dr. Carter was giving a presentation on unconscious bias in medical care, and for the first time, Harrison was not there out of obligation. He had chosen to attend because he genuinely wanted to learn. The topic was close to home. Even a few seconds of hesitation can cost a life, Dr. Carter explained, showing slides of emergency room statistics. When we let our assumptions affect our judgment, patients suffer. Harrison thought back to the incident with Senator Brooks just 2 weeks earlier. He remembered the family's immediate distrust, their automatic assumption that a white male doctor would be better qualified. He also recalled his own assumptions on the day of Dr. Carter's hearing, and how his face had grown warm with shame at the thought. During the lunch break, Harrison noticed something that would have escaped his attention in the past. As Dr. Carter walked to the coffee station, several people shifted uncomfortably, subtly moving aside to make room for her, not out of respect but out of discomfort. A young white doctor grabbed the last sandwich just as Dr. Carter reached for it, not even acknowledging her presence. You see it now, don't you? A voice beside him said. It was Dr. Wilson, the hospital CEO, who had joined him during the break. The little things. The tiny dismissals that add up day after day. Harrison nodded slowly. I see them. Because she taught me to look. Dr. Wilson's expression softened. How does she handle it all with such grace? Harrison was quiet for a moment, contemplating the question. Finally, Dr. Wilson spoke again, his voice low and understanding. She doesn't have a choice. Show anger and you're aggressive. Show frustration and you're emotional. But show grace and you rise above it all. That's how she handles it. Every single day. As Harrison watched Dr. Carter move through the room, her head held high despite the slights, he realized that the lessons she had taught him were more than just professional. They were about life, about how we see others, and how we see ourselves. And for the first time in years, Harrison felt that perhaps he was truly starting to see the world for what it was. Dr. Carter excelled in a way that made it impossible for others to ignore her. She wasn't just good at her job. She was so outstanding, so undeniably skilled and capable, that it forced even the most reluctant to acknowledge her. It wasn't just a matter of her competence, though that was, of course, a significant part of it. It was her resilience in the face of bias and prejudice that made her truly exceptional. For every dismissive glance or condescending comment, Dr. Carter continued to rise, her actions speaking louder than any assumptions or slights thrown her way. The day after lunch, Harrison attended a department heads meeting where Dr. Carter presented her plans for the South Atlanta Cardiac Center. As he listened, he noticed something subtle but telling. Several of the board members checked their phones as she spoke, their attention clearly wavering. Others interrupted her more frequently than they had with previous presenters, questioning her every word. Dr. Carter remained composed, her eyes fixed on her presentation, but Harrison could see the irritation flicker in her gaze as she skillfully navigated their interruptions. After the third interruption, Harrison couldn't remain silent. Please continue, he said, his voice firm and authoritative, cutting through the tension in the room. The point about emergency response times is crucial. Dr. Carter gave him a slight nod of appreciation, the briefest acknowledgement that didn't escape Harrison's notice. For the first time he truly understood the importance of having allies, of being willing to step up when injustice reared its head, even in small ways. The rest of the meeting continued without further disruptions, but Harrison's mind was racing. He had witnessed countless instances of bias throughout his career, but seeing it so plainly in this professional setting was a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained these issues were, even in institutions that were supposed to be a model of meritocracy. That evening, as he walked to his car, Harrison overheard two nurses talking near the elevator. "Did you hear they're making us take another bias training next week?" one of them said, her tone dripping with frustration. "I know it's ridiculous. I treat everyone the same. This is just political correctness gone mad." Harrison paused, his hand on the elevator button, and listened. He recognized the attitude. Hadn't he thought the same way not too long ago? He had prided himself on being fair, on treating everyone equally, never considering that perhaps his sense of fairness was skewed by unconscious biases. The realization hit him with full force, and he thought back to the moment Dr. Carter had made him confront his own prejudice in her courtroom months before. The next morning, Harrison did something unprecedented. He requested a thorough review of all his court decisions from the past year, specifically looking at fine amounts, sentencing patterns, and whether race or gender had played a role in those decisions. He spent hours poring over the data, feeling a growing sense of discomfort as he analyzed the numbers. The pattern was undeniable: harsher sentences for minorities, higher fines for women of color, less patience in hearing their explanations, less willingness to consider alternative evidence. The disparities were staggering. Sitting in his office, Harrison couldn't look away from the screen. He was stunned by what he saw, how his own decisions that he had thought were based solely on the facts, were shaped by subconscious biases he had never considered. The weight of that realization bore down on him, and after a long pause he picked up the phone and called Dr. Carter. "I want to do better," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "Not just in the hospital but in my courtroom too. Would you be willing to review my new court procedures? Help me identify where bias might be affecting my judgment?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Dr. Carter responded, her voice calm and measured. "Judge Harrison, do you know how rare it is for someone in your position to even admit there might be a problem?" "I had a good teacher," Harrison replied, his voice soft but sincere. "Someone who showed me that true justice requires us to look at our own prejudices first." Dr. Carter was silent for a moment, perhaps considering his words. "All right," she said finally. "Let's work together." They agreed to meet weekly to review and revise his courtroom procedures, to identify places where unconscious bias might still be at play. It was the beginning of a new chapter for Harrison, one in which he would have to confront difficult truths about himself and the system he had been part of for so long. But it didn't stop there. Harrison's commitment to change also extended to the broader community. He started attending meetings in South Atlanta, listening to residents' stories about their experiences with the legal system. He heard about the hurdles they faced, the deep-seated mistrust many had of the system, and the way people of color were often treated unfairly in courtrooms, both large and small. Harrison felt a deep sense of shame but also a newfound urgency. He could no longer afford to remain passive. It was time to act. One afternoon, as Harrison watched Dr. Carter handle yet another dismissive comment from a colleague, he realized something important. Change wasn't just about attending workshops or revising procedures. It was about paying attention, speaking up when something was wrong, and being willing to feel uncomfortable as you confronted your own biases. Harrison could feel the shift within himself. He wasn't the same man who had dismissed Dr. Carter months ago. He had learned from her grace under pressure, from her willingness to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. "You know," Dr. Carter said to him later that week as they reviewed hospital policies, "when you found me that day in court, I never imagined we'd end up here." Harrison smiled, his gaze meeting hers. "Neither did I. But I'm grateful for that traffic ticket now. It opened my eyes to things I needed to see." Dr. Carter's smile was small but knowing. "The journey's not over," she reminded him. "No," Harrison agreed, picking up another policy document and scanning it briefly. "But at least now I know I'm heading in the right direction." A few weeks later, the Atlanta Judicial Review Board convened for a meeting, and Harrison stood at the podium, his heart beating rapidly in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that what he was about to say would be heard by colleagues who might never look at him the same way again. But he was no longer concerned with their judgment. He had made his peace with his own flaws, and now it was time to address them publicly. "I'm here today," Harrison began, his voice steady and clear, "to report a failure of justice in my own courtroom." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Harrison saw the startled expressions of his fellow judges and lawyers. He glanced toward the front row where Dr. Carter sat quietly watching him intently. The room fell silent as Harrison continued. 3 months ago, he said, I wrongfully fined Dr. Michelle Carter, the chief of cardiology at Grady Memorial Hospital, for a traffic violation she didn't commit. But the real injustice wasn't just the fine. It was my conduct, my assumptions, and my refusal to even look at the evidence she tried to present. The room grew still, the magnitude of his words sinking in. It was rare for a judge to voluntarily admit misconduct, especially in such a public forum. But Harrison had reached a point where he could no longer stay silent about his own failures. I reviewed my court records from the past year, Harrison continued, projecting charts onto the screen behind him. The data shows clear patterns of bias in my decisions. On average, I imposed 40% higher fines on minorities. I interrupted female defendants twice as often as male defendants. I was less likely to accept explanations or review evidence from people of color. Some of the judges in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing that similar patterns might exist in their own courtrooms. But Harrison wasn't done. Today, he said, his voice growing stronger, I'm not just here to admit these failures. I'm here to propose changes. He clicked to the next slide, showing a list of new procedures. First, we will have a mandatory review of all fine patterns every 3 months, broken down by race, gender, and economic status. Second, we'll implement standardized evidence review procedures that must be followed regardless of who stands before us. Third, there will be required documentation when maximum fines are imposed, explaining why lesser penalties weren't chosen. Dr. Carter watched him with a quiet sense of pride, knowing how far he had come. Harrison continued. I'm also proposing mandatory training on unconscious bias, not just once a year but quarterly. And not just for judges but for all court personnel. A senior judge raised his hand. This sounds expensive and time-consuming, Harrison. Is it really necessary? Harrison glanced at Dr. Carter, a quiet confidence in his eyes. Let me tell you about a cardiac surgeon who was rushing to save a life when she got a speeding ticket. Let me tell you about how I refused to even look at her hospital emergency records. How I silenced a police officer trying to correct a clerical error. How I nearly let my assumptions and prejudices prevent a highly qualified doctor from doing her job. He clicked to another slide showing emergency response times in different Atlanta neighborhoods. Every delayed decision, every dismissed piece of evidence, every rushed judgment, affects real lives. In my courtroom, I almost prioritized my assumptions over justice. How many times have we all done this without even realizing it? The room grew quiet, each person considering the weight of his words. Harrison knew that change wouldn't come easily, but this was the first step, and it was a step he was ready to take. Harrison stood before the audience, his words slowly sinking in as they hit home for many present. He wasn't proud of what had happened in his courtroom that day, he admitted, but he was determined to learn from it. Dr. Carter could have filed a complaint against me, he said, his voice steady but filled with humility, but instead she chose to educate me, to show me how justice looks through different eyes. His confession, so public and raw, resonated with those in the room, and he could feel the weight of their attention. They knew, perhaps even better than he did, how difficult it was to admit when you were wrong, especially when your own position and power made it so easy to overlook your biases. As he introduced his final proposal, Harrison spoke with quiet conviction. He suggested the creation of a new oversight committee that would include community members from all parts of Atlanta, ensuring diverse perspectives in the judicial review process. This would make sure that decisions weren't just made by those within the system, but were informed by those affected by it. We call ourselves servants of justice, he concluded, but true justice requires us to first face our own prejudices. It requires us to be accountable, to be willing to change, and to be brave enough to admit when we're wrong. The room fell silent as his words lingered in the air, and Harrison watched as his colleagues absorbed the full weight of what he was proposing. There were no immediate reactions, but as the meeting began to adjourn, people slowly filed out, discussing the proposed changes amongst themselves. Dr. Carter approached Harrison, her face soft with understanding. That couldn't have been easy, she said. Harrison loosened his tie slightly, feeling the weight of the moment. Easier than continuing to pretend I didn't have these biases, he replied. Easier than letting others face the same unfair treatment I gave you. He looked at her, the meaning of their shared journey more evident now than ever. Change starts with acknowledgement, he said softly. She nodded, a small but knowing smile playing on her lips. You've taken the first step. Many of your colleagues might follow. Looking around at the dispersing crowd, Harrison saw several judges already deep in conversation, discussing the new proposals, some nodding thoughtfully in agreement. Maybe, he said, his voice filled with cautious optimism, we can make the system a little fairer. One courtroom at a time. Dr. Carter smiled but corrected him gently, one mind at a time. Harrison thought about her words as they both walked out of the building. He had changed, he knew that now. His transformation had been gradual but undeniable. 1 year earlier it had been a traffic ticket, an event he had initially dismissed as trivial, that had set him on this path. Now that ticket had become the catalyst for a chain of events that had reshaped both his life and his view of justice. He had learned and now he was helping to teach others. 1 year after that pivotal traffic court incident, Judge Harrison and Dr. Carter stood together at the grand opening of the South Atlanta Cardiac Care Center. A large crowd had gathered, a mix of hospital staff, community members and city officials, all eager to celebrate the new facility. The center gleamed under the bright autumn sun, its modern exterior a sharp contrast to the abandoned building it had once been. A red ribbon stretched across the entrance, waiting to be cut, and behind it, state-of-the-art cardiac equipment was visible through the windows, ready to serve a community that had waited far too long for proper medical care. Hard to believe this all started with a traffic ticket, Harrison said quietly, standing next to Dr. Carter as they waited for the ceremony to begin. She smiled, adjusting her white coat as she glanced at him. Sometimes the best changes come from unexpected places. The past year had transformed both their lives in ways they had never anticipated. The judicial reforms Harrison had proposed were being adopted by courts across Atlanta. Bias training had become mandatory for all judges, and fine patterns were regularly reviewed for signs of discrimination. In his own courtroom, Harrison had earned a reputation for his careful attention to evidence and his fair treatment of all defendants, no longer swayed by assumptions or prejudices. Dr. Carter's cardiac center had already saved dozens of lives during its soft opening phase. Emergency response times in South Atlanta had dropped from 45 minutes to just 12, a remarkable improvement that had saved countless lives. The hospital board had even begun using their partnership as a model for other departments, seeing firsthand how much more effective their work could be when it was informed by diverse perspectives, not just within the medical field, but also the community at large. Mayor Johnson stepped up to the podium, ready to speak to the gathered crowd. Today, she began, we celebrate more than just a new medical facility. We celebrate what can happen when people work together, when they learn from each other, and when they choose to see beyond their assumptions. As the mayor spoke, Harrison scanned the crowd, noting familiar faces among the sea of people. Gregory Brooks, the son of Senator Brooks, was there, now a regular volunteer at the hospital. The senator himself had become a strong supporter of the cardiac center after his own recovery. Even Officer Brooks, who had written Harrison's traffic ticket, was present, now serving on the police department's community relations board, helping bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. I'd like to invite our co-chairs, Judge Richard Harrison and Dr. Michelle Carter, to cut the ribbon, the mayor announced. Harrison and Dr. Carter stepped forward, accepting the large ceremonial scissors. Cameras flashed as they posed, but Harrison's mind wasn't focused on the crowd or the press. Instead, he thought back to their first real conversation in Dr. Carter's hospital office, when she had shown him the dashboard camera footage of the traffic stop, and how defensive and angry he had felt in that moment. Now, standing beside her at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, he was filled with gratitude for that moment of truth, and how it had led him to this place. On 3, Dr. Carter said, smiling at him. 1, 2, 3. The ribbon fell to the ground with a soft rustling sound, and applause erupted from the crowd. People began to file inside, eagerly touring the new facility, exploring its state-of-the-art equipment and bright, welcoming rooms. As the crowd thinned, an elderly woman approached Harrison and Dr. Carter. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched Dr. Carter's hand. "My Harold," she said, her voice trembling. "He had a heart attack last week. If this center hadn't been here," she turned to Harrison, her gratitude overwhelming. "Thank you both. Thank you for caring about our community." Later, as the crowd continued to disperse, Harrison and Dr. Carter walked through the new facility. Each room was equipped with the latest technology, each waiting area designed to be as welcoming and comfortable as possible. The walls were adorned with artwork from local artists, making the space feel truly connected to the community it served. "You know," Harrison said, stopping by a window that overlooked the neighborhood, "I used to think justice was just about following the law. Black and white. Right and wrong." Dr. Carter joined him by the window, her gaze following his as they both took in the view. And now? Now I know it's about seeing people. Really seeing them. Their circumstances, their challenges, their humanity. Dr. Carter smiled gently. We taught each other. Harrison nodded, his thoughts already shifting to the future. Their work was far from done. The changes they had made were just the beginning, and there was still so much to be done. But, for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. At that moment, the sharp sound of a code blue alarm rang through the halls, and Dr. Carter immediately straightened, her professional instincts kicking in. She turned to Harrison as she hurried off. Same time next week? We still have those court documentation procedures to review. Harrison smiled, nodding. I'll bring the coffee. As he watched Dr. Carter rush off to save another life, he reflected on how far they had come, from a mishandled traffic ticket to a partnership that was changing the city. One heart, one case at a time. Outside, the sun was setting over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the city. But inside the new cardiac center, the lights blazed brightly, ready to serve all who needed help, regardless of who they were or where they came from. And as Harrison thought about it, he realized this was what justice and healing looked like, when they worked together.